In this panel, we are very, very fortunate to have yet another distinguished group of experts and thought leaders and people who have helped drive some of the conversations about globalization through their deeds and their thoughts. And we are doubly fortunate that one of the people who has been one of the North Stars of the public intellectual conversation of the school over all 30 years, Jim Fallows, the national correspondent of The Atlantic, agreed to come back to be with us today, and he is going to be the moderator of this panel. So welcome, Jim, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Peter. Congratulations to the whole GPS family on this wonderful 30th anniversary. Under your reign and that of Peter Gorovich and all the sagas of the IRPS, GPS history over the decades, I've enjoyed coming here. I've always learned from being here. I really value the connection, so I'm honored to be part of the gathering. At the end of the previous session, Renee Bowen very graciously wished all the members of this panel good luck, because we're supposed to talk about the various conformations of global institutional shock, of changes in the world order and how to think about them. I think the panel has been put together by the organizers of the conference in a very useful and indeed intentional way. From the opening last night, where we heard from Peter and Peter about the kinds of large-scale global dislocations. They're part of the founding of this institution three decades ago. We've heard from Jeff Immolton from our previous panel about some of the details of how these changes are affecting businesses and governments and citizens and communities. And now our goal for the next while is to try to talk about another era of large-scale global dislocation and how to think about it. 30 years ago, when the institution here was founded, of course, as you heard last night, those dislocations included the end of the Soviet Union, reunification of Germany, new prospects for Europe, a new era in China, and many others. We now know, we've already heard in the past few hours about the kinds of dislocations that are going on now. Changes in the balance between the national and the international, changes in the foundations of people's livelihoods, and a whole other range. To explore some of these recastings of the fundamentals of global governance, of global economics, of national prospects, of community and business development, we have an excellent panel. I'll just give you an overview of each of them now and say a little more before each of them makes an initial presentation. Starting on the far side of the podium is Bob Hormats, who of course is a veteran practitioner of statecraft from the public, private, and analytical realms over the decades. He's now the Kissinger Associates. He was a longtime Undersecretary of State, longtime Vice Chair of Goldman Sachs International, and he has been, as you heard in his questions from the previous session, he has a view of how this era is similar to and different from other eras in the disruptive period. So we'll hear from him. Next to him is Jennifer Harris, who's now a senior fellow at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, who's been doing very original contemporary work on the modern dimensions of statecraft and war and peace and global conflict resolution. She's worked for the U.S. National Intelligence Council on the policy planning staff of the State Department. She has a JD from Yale and a master's from Oxford, and has been any august institution you can think of she's been part of in her brief but spectacular career. So Jennifer Harris is there. Next to her is Gabriela Ramos, who's the chief of staff of the OECD and the Sherpa for the G20. Originally a Mexican government official, she's been involved in issues of sustaining global governance, making it viable in this period of stress that it's undergoing, as we've heard, making it inclusive for all of the various people and the communities around the world who are affected thereby. And next to her is Arati Prabhakar, who you all know for her extraordinary experience in both the business finance side of evolving technologies and the governmental policy side thereof. Very recently, she was, of course, the director of DARPA, And I think if there's one position in the U.S. government that the GPS community would like to have its people associated with, it be the director of DARPA, where she did extraordinary work. And she's been involved in early stage startups in Silicon Valley. What we're going to do, I have a whole list of big think, jawbreaker type questions that the panel has been prepped for. And they know we're going to try to talk about whether it's a new era of great power rivalry and what the nation state is like in this time of history, and on down a list. The way we're going to set that up is that each one of the panelists is going to give an introductory, relatively brief presentation on the perspective that he or she would like to lay out for us in these considerations. And we have an order planned for that. Then I will lead the panelists in a discussion of any jawbreaker questions they have omitted. And then we'll, as we saw from the previous session, there is plenty of interest from the audience here. So we'll make sure we have lots of times for interactive questions. So here's the order we're going to be talking about. First, we're going to hear from Bob Hormats, again, setting the stage on how this era resembles or differs from other eras of change, what points he thinks are most important. Then we're going to hear from Gabriela Ramos on what we should know about the viability of international governance as a whole, international institutions, about the inclusiveness of this past era and coming era in economic and other events and sustainability. Then we're going to hear from Jennifer Harris on the evolving strategies of statecraft and competition and warfare from other means. And then we're going to hear from Arati about her perspective on the technology dynamics of this era and what we may be underappreciating about them, in either their dystopian or their less dystopian aspects. That is the plan, so please now, Bob Hormats, I welcome you to the stage, to the podium.
Well, first of all, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Peter for organizing this and Jeff for his terrific remarks. He's an old friend and always has something thoughtful to say, and always something that relates to how to look at the future and how to look at it in a very constructive fashion. Of course, being on a panel with a lot of old friends is going to be a lot of fun and very interesting. I'd just like to make, in the interest of brevity, a few broad points about the global system and the global order as it is likely to evolve over the next several years, and make one fundamental point that I think is a good way of starting the process of a discussion, and that is that the greatest threat to the current global order as we have come to know it over the last 40, 50, 60 years really is not external, it's internal. To be sure, there's a rising set of powers in the emerging world, China being the leader, and we'll talk, as we did in the last panel, about it, and we'll get to that. But I'd like to make a deeper point, and that is what's really different about the current environment is the kinds of internal pressures that are threatening the global order and America's leadership of the global order. And it's not just the United States. You see it in Western Europe, and I would characterize it in a couple of ways. One of which is that it's much easier for political forces to oppose than it is to put together an affirmative agenda. And the best example of this, but certainly not the only one, is Brexit. There was an agreement, not a huge majority, but a majority to get out of the EU. There was no, and still for 2 years, has not been an area of affirmative agreement on what comes next. In the United States, there are great groups, large groups of people who oppose certain things, but it's been very difficult to develop an affirmative action internally and very difficult to develop an affirmative action program internationally as well. And I would make the point that unless we're able in this country and in other Western countries to deal with our own internal problems, it's going to be extremely difficult for us to assume leadership roles to reshape the global economic order. where do those agreements need to reside? Where do we need to find areas of compromise so that we can strengthen the functionality and the effectiveness of our own domestic systems? If we don't do that, we will not prove to be very effective models internationally, and we will not have the domestic consensus we need to play a leadership role in the world. And I would underscore the point that why was the U.S. so effective from the late 1940s on? There was a very strong consensus in this country about the role the U.S. needed to play externally, in part because there was a relatively strong consensus within this country as to how to move forward to create broader prosperity among Americans after World War II. There was a sense of opportunity, the kind of manufacturing jobs that paid good salaries that Jeff was talking about existed. Our society was a pretty unified society and based on the notion of consensus internally. Doesn't mean there weren't political differences. And when you had a consensus internally and you had a substantial amount of harmony internally, it was much easier for the U.S. to play a role internationally. As long as we're divided internally, it's going to be very hard to muster the kind of support, the kind of consensus in this country for a strong external role. And in particular, there are a couple of examples. One is how you deal with income inequality. As long as people perceive income inequality and inequality of opportunity, then the political forces are going to be divided internally and force the domestic debate away from the international side to the domestic side. The second is demographics, and that is an aging population at this point is going to require more and more money transfers from the government through the Social Security system and through Medicare in particular, and through unfunded corporate pension plans and unfunded municipal plans. We're going to suck not only money out of the system that is going to be required to pay these bills that have been the result of commitments made by past generations, but the public attention is going to be much more on these domestic issues than on playing a global leadership role. And there won't be as much money for the military. There won't be as much money for foreign assistance. There won't be as much political attention to international leadership if we're so preoccupied with dealing with our own domestic financial issues and dealing with issues of inequality and lack of opportunity in the educational area, issues of health care. You're going to see so little debate in the current campaign about the international aspects of American leadership, far less, I suspect, than in any major political campaign we've had since World War II. This doesn't mean there won't be some, but not really very much, and maybe focused on China and the Russia investigation. The third point is that we've looked, and when the numbers were used in the last debate about the question of trade, that generally society benefits from the efficiency of additional trade. I would say it's important to make a distinction between American support for trade and American support for trade agreements. There's been a lot of arguments that trade agreements, and Trump makes this point, but it's not just Trump, have been unfair to the United States. We haven't really struck tough deals with the Chinese. And then the notion comes from economists, well, in the aggregate, people will be better off. The fact is, individuals don't live in the aggregate. They live their own lives, whether they can get a good job, whether they can feed their kids, whether their kids have greater opportunity. I think these internal divisions are going to be a much more difficult process for the United States and for Western Europe and other countries. And the demographics in particular are going to work in another direction, which is going to essentially feed this greater degree of nationalism or sovereignty on steroids, and that is, as our population growth slows, in some cases declines, there's more and more population, younger people, in the emerging economies in Latin America and Africa, and they're looking for job opportunities. And where are they looking? They're looking in the United States. They're looking in Western Europe. They're looking at other developed countries. So this pressure for migration, which in many ways for economic reasons we need because of our declining labor force. We need a strong labor force, and in fact they're very productive for the reasons that were mentioned in the last panel. The resistance to that, the xenophobia that migration produces, is going to be another factor that is going to force retreat from or disinterest in global leadership. So I just want to sort of start the predicate of this conversation saying a lot of what happens internally is going to be very important. And I'll just conclude by making a few points, and that is, and just to touch on them, there are a lot of things that need to be done in our own domestic interest that cannot be done only by the United States. And therefore, if there is to be some increase in focus on globalization, it will not be through the traditional institutions that we've talked about. It'll be because they're functional, critical challenges. A global financial crisis. We've seen them in the past. You can't solve it one country alone. It has to be, and the US and China worked together on the last one, and were critical to resolving it. If there's a global pandemic, it can't be resolved by one country alone. The question of data nationalism, digital nationalism, which is a big risk as countries want to emphasize their protection of their own privacy, want to emphasize that if there's a cloud, it's their cloud. They're not going to use American servers, they're going to use servers in Germany or Brazil or China. The whole question of the world being pulled together by technology can be fragmented by the fact that countries resort to technology nationalism. Climate, it's an issue that one country can't resolve. There are numerous other issues, so if there is to be hope for the global economic order, it is that we recognize that when these big challenges occur that have a big effect on us, invoking sovereignty, invoking xenophobia, invoking nationalism may feel good for a couple of days, but it will not resolve those problems. That's why the world had the situation it had during the period between World War I and World War II, because all these global issues were not dealt with globally, they were dealt with through nationalistic measures, which were a disaster. We learned over the last 70 years that doesn't work. Well, these new challenges that I've identified, and there are numerous others that I have not, will they lead us over a certain period of time to realize that while we still may want to be more nationalistic than in the past, solutions to these problems are not going to be done one-on-one, and in particular, they won't be done without China and the U.S. working together. So after we resolve the U.S.-China trade issue, if we do, we need to have a dialogue with the U.S. and the Chinese about how our two countries work together to make the global order work better, because we both have an interest in doing it. We'll probably discuss this at considerable length. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, for setting up an excellent predicate or premise for our discussion about the way the internal contradictions of the U.S. situation may make it retreat from familiar ways of global involvement, but a whole new set of crises and exigencies may draw countries back together. Many of you in the room, probably like me, have spent time in the speechwriting business over the decades, and Bob was just doing a very elegant version of the part of the speechwriter's toolkit, which is a strong foreign policy starts at home. It is true that you have to have a robust and a nation that is dealing with its own internal contradictions before it can move beyond those. Now to hear about the similar set of challenges from her perspective in working at the heart of a crucial international organization, let's hear from Gabriela Ramos.
Thank you, James. Thanks so much for the invitation, Peter. Great to be here. Very first time I'm in the West Coast. I have to admit, I lived in the East Coast, so it's great to be brought here. And I have to say that after hearing Bob, with whom I work closely on many issues, particularly on the G20, where we have very great successes, I feel almost like saying ditto. It's perfect. But no, I won't escape my responsibility to bring the OECD perspective. I will not assume that you all know what's the OECD. The OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. One of the most impressive action of the U.S. generosity to implement the Marshall Plan to reconstruct Europe. And afterwards, we became the house of best practices, the house of data, the house of benchmarks. We work in all the policy areas. And I have to say that I love the quote by the Finnish philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, who said, life cannot be understood by looking backwards. You need to look backwards to understand life, but you need to go forward to live it. So that's where I want to start my conversation. And this is important because I have been working for the OECD, and the OECD is part of the support system for the G20, the analytical support system of the G20. Enrico Letta is here. He was prime minister. We work also together. And we used to think that we have a GPS to congratulate GPS. We used to think that we have a GPS because in 2015 we achieved the climate agreement, and it was a source of great pride. It was not only Christiana who was mentioned, but it was also Laurent Fabius, but it was also the US and China working together. Because we saw how much, through the G20 and through the policy perspective that you implemented during that decade, we brought China to recognize that they had something to do about climate change, that they have something to do about trade, that they have something to do respecting global rules. And I think you managed to move, because I remember when I started working with you in 2009 in the G20, China would say, don't talk to me about climate, you made it, not my mistake, I will not engage in that. And through cooperation, through very strong diplomacy, and I have to make an announcement because with GPS and with Sciences Po, we're going to launch an economic diplomacy program, because this is the work of many people that really engage and try to build common understandings. And we had this GPS that was telling us where to go on climate, but we also have a GPS that was telling us where to go on the SDGs, which was one of the most interesting achievements of the United Nations. But I have to say that you said, Bob, that no problem can be solved only by the US, but I can tell you, being a Mexican working in an international organization in Paris, there's no problem that can be solved without the US. And this is where we are now. This is where we feel the leadership that we used to have in terms of where we want to go for international institutions is kind of, where is it? Where do we go? Where is the guidance? We used to organize our thinking to say, I agree or I disagree, by the US first saying, we're there. And that was amazing, because sometimes we would say on trade, on WTO reform, on China, on whatever thing, you will get rooms together where people will say, I completely disagree with the US, or I completely agree with the US. But there was a pillar that was telling us where would you stand on these issues. I also think that there is a crisis of governance, nationally, internationally. It took 9 months for the Czech Republic to form a government. It took 7 months to the Dutch. It took 5 months to the Germans to form a government. And it's taking longer and longer. Italy, we have Brexit. It's just so complicated to bring together solutions through through a democratic processes, because we are so divided, as you mentioned, and because we are so radically opposed. We have the Gilets jaunes in France, and societies are not really getting any agreement. So I think this crisis of governance, in some ways, internally, the expression of the most radical options being elected in many countries, including in mine, it's creating a context where it's very difficult to agree internally, but then this translates immediately in the international context. Is not delinked. I think that the way Bob presented this fact of the multi-level interactions that need to come from domestic, international, and then bring forward the solutions, of course, is so important. And then the rise of populism, the rise of isolationism, not only in the US, everywhere, I have to say, is a trend, is not only an exception. There are reasons for this. It's not that we didn't earn it. And I have to say, everybody that was there to produce certain answers. You mentioned inequality. I work with an organization that has the most advanced economies, 35 of the most advanced economies, who have well-developed social safety nets. But you see that 40% of their populations had totally flat income growth during the last decade, while there has been a very high concentration at the top of the growth benefits that we have during the last decade. Could you imagine that 40% of wealth is owned by 10% of the top income groups in these countries, which are supposed to have systems to redistribute wealth and to have effective tax systems and benefit systems, and still the concentration goes on and on and on. Inequality of income leads to inequality of opportunities, and this explains the yellow vest in France, because I live in France. The level of wealth is so high than the well-being, that I'm wondering, why are they protesting? Well, because this is the lack of opportunities. It's not only about having access to good services or to have education, is how much you can fulfill your own potential. And this is what youngsters are saying. They don't go and vote. And this is what many families that come out and demonstrate is telling us. We just presented 2 weeks ago the squeezed middle class. And you see, again, 40% of our populations having stagnant wages, well, they have to be paying more for housing, more for health, more for education, getting into indebtedness. So I think these are the real questions, and we need to look for solutions to those issues if we really want to move forward. The paradox is that the challenges are so huge that you need very effective governments and very effective international governance, and we are in a situation that is very difficult to deliver. On climate, what can I tell you? You know it. I think that this is, the last 4 years are the warmest in human history. The loss of biodiversity is just by the day impressive. And in terms of the climate agreement that the world delivered, only 11 countries have presented their plans of how they are going to go for a low carbon growth. And we have just 10 years to reduce the emissions by 40% to reach probably 2 or 3%, not 1.5 degrees. That was the outcome that we wanted to get in Paris, but just 3%. So these are good reasons, and I think that this is the kind of thing that we are facing. And then you add up to this uncertainty the question of digitalization, automation, and how are we going to be addressing. We discussed about this, Jeff. The fact is that there are lots of anxiety, and there's lack of trust. And this is my point, the trust, how do we recover it to really move forward? So the paradox, we need better governance, we need much more effective governance internationally and domestically, and we are in a context in which it's very difficult to have it. Just to close, I completely agree also with Bob. I think that there is a need for international cooperation to arrive to the right decisions and the right solutions. But there is also a need to understand better how the world works. I don't think that we understand the level of interconnectedness we have in the global economy. I don't think we understand that the growth of China during the last 2 decades is thanks to many investors, particularly U.S. investors, 150 billion foreign direct investment in China. Trade is one point in this discussion. We continue discussing trade as in the Ricardian, the comparative advantages, and I close borders, and when 70% of the world trade is done in global value chains, which means that products come and cross several times borders and have no longer one mark made in the US or made in. If you measure the deficit between China and the US, the trade deficit that is informing the policies, it will be 40% lower if you're measuring in value added, in trade in value added. Why? Because 40% of the products in China are inputs from your countries, from the US and from Europe. So it's not China-made. So I think that we really need to understand better and explain better these issues. I have to say that whenever there is a need for a global agreement, even in this stage, we find ways to do it. I'm proud to say that the OECD has been working to try to fix the tax international regime. to try to develop a standard, a joint standard for avoiding tax evasion and tax erosion, and to go developing also a rule for taxing digital. So I feel that the compelling case is there. For China, I will just say, ditto, Bob, we need to engage. And by the way, thank you for this. Let's avoid plastic, please. Let's avoid bottle plastics. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gabriela Ramos. I think you can see an interesting continuity from Bob Hormats' presentation to the second one we've heard about the contradictions of this moment, of the large tensions. Bob was talking about the forces pushing the United States away from global leadership, but the forces that will necessarily pull it back. Gabriela was talking about the crises, structural crises of international governance, where the U.S. can't do things by itself, but nobody else can do it without the U.S. The crises of national democratic governance, where democracies are electing their most extreme views, and then all the other resulting effects of inclusiveness and inequality and climate and all the rest. To continue this discussion, we're now going to hear from Jennifer Harris. Her recent book was War by Other Means, of course playing on diplomacy by other means, about the modern dimensions of competition, of resolving contradictory interests, of the ways in which nations in the international system resolve their business. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Harris.
A few promises up at the outset that I hope to be able to keep. One, I'd actually like to connect the kind of focus of evolutions in geopolitical competition with a lot of the themes that Bob and Gabriela touched on in terms of increasing domestic priorities. And two, I'd like to end on an optimistic note. So to fulfill both of those promises, I'm going to need to talk quickly. I apologize to you and to my mother, who for 37 years has asked me to improve on that front. So I'd like to start with a story. And this one begins in 2012 in Kiev. Bob and I were both at the State Department at the time when things started heating up at the Ukrainian border. But this one, at the time of 2012, this was well before protesters were filling the squares in the Maidan. And Vladimir Putin was in Kiev to celebrate a little-known holiday called the Baptism of the Kievan Rus. It's sort of the spiritual anniversary of the Ukrainian nation, and he called on kind of appealed to the cultural solidarity, appealing to the longstanding ties between Ukraine and Russia. But pretty quickly his tone changed, and he made an appeal to economic solidarity, in particular calling on the Ukrainian government to reject the then pending EU partnership agreement in favor of Moscow's own self-fashioned alternative. And as if to underscore the point, the next day, when he got back to Russia, he sanctioned chocolates. These were Russian chocolates, not just any chocolates. These chocolates happen to be owned by one Petro Poroshenko, who would soon be known to all of us as the Prime Minister of Ukraine. And it was sort of, didn't go unnoticed by a lot of the diplomats in Eastern Europe. And one Baltic former foreign minister saw this playing out, and she said, after chocolates, pretty sure it's going to be cheese. After cheese, it'll be pipelines. After pipelines, it'll be something else. I don't know what. But I can assure you that the closer we get to the deadline for this EU partnership agreement, the more these quote-unquote non-standard situations will grow. Right she was. Fast forward a few months, and Ukraine saw its exports to Russia, its largest export partner, drop some 25-30% just over a matter of 3 or 4 months. Always quick to mix carrots in with sticks. Russia sort of went to its newly enfeebled neighbor with a bailout package, some $15 billion in financing discounts and energy discounts, a lot of which were repurposed from Russia's own sovereign wealth fund. The sovereign wealth funds have been a sort of asset class that has been growing over the past 10, 15 years. And sitting at the State Department wondering how these sort of coffers of the state could be deployed for not just economic but geopolitical gain, I had some concerns. I was always assured these are purely market players out for purely economic profit, right up until in situations like Ukraine, they weren't. They became repurposed very much as geopolitical instruments out for a set of geopolitical aims. And so the point of my book and the argument I would like to kind of tease out with all of you today is that Russia's not alone in this form of statecraft. Increasingly, this seems to be what is passing for the mode of diplomacy that more and more countries are subscribing to. China, another good example, allows Filipino bananas to rot on its docks when it wants to underscore a point to its neighbor on the kind of boundaries of the South China Sea. It rewards Taiwanese companies that march to Beijing's desired cadence on Taiwan questions and punishes those that do not. It has steadily reduced the number of countries around the world that recognize Taiwan on the back of this sort of diplomatic pressure, has curtailed the activities and the diplomatic support for the Dalai Lama, using the same set of tactics. The Gulf states, in 2015, sort of the height of the Arab Spring, you saw them tender about $12 billion in aid packages to Egypt, as Bob and I were sort of nervously wondering whether we should go to Congress to ask for a $1 billion supplemental or fidgeting over the details of a $1 billion loan forgiveness instrument. It seems almost cute and quaint in retrospect. And I think more often than not, this form of statecraft works. It's sure imperfect and messy in all the ways that you would expect, but we have seen real results, and I think the kind of changing boundaries of the South and East China Sea are probably example number one, as is the changing dynamics in the Middle East. By contrast, consider some of the most recent U.S. foreign policy debates. Should we establish a permanent military presence in Eastern Europe? Sort of what is the sort of set of bombing campaigns and permanent troop presence in the Middle East that will be necessary to deal with ISIS? It was an attack on Iran's nuclear facility really an option for President Obama, with the important exception of sanctions. And I don't want to belittle the evolutions that we've seen in U.S. foreign policy in the area of sanctions. This is not a set of muscles that the U.S. regularly exercises. We still look first to the application of military instruments to work our will in the world. And it wasn't always so. Back into the very early days of the founding of this country, for whatever disagreements Jefferson and Hamilton had, they both agreed on the power of commerce as a national security strategy. When you go back and read the National Report on Manufacturers that Hamilton wrote, it was industrial policy as the kind of young republic's best protection against the security threats that Britain represented. The Civil War, I think we convinced the UK to stay neutral on the threat of relieving them of their investments in early American securities. During the Taft years, dollar diplomacy, perhaps a deeply flawed example of this kind of what I call geoeconomic muscle, but a powerful example nonetheless. Lend-Lease, the Marshall Plan, Gabriela mentioned, probably the high watermark of the U.S.'s ability to exercise power by reference to a set of economic tools. But somewhere along the way, things changed. And my story dates to Vietnam as really where we began to put some of our economic might on the shelf. And I think there are a whole host of reasons for that. Many of the material was the first sort of moment of economic insecurity the country had experienced in a generation. You see some of them were geopolitical. You had a Cold War turned hot for the first time that necessitated the revival of defense tactics to kind of begin to drive most of the foreign policy apparatus in Washington. But I think that the most powerful example, and here's where I want to kind of transition to the set of domestic factors, has to do less with what was going on in foreign policy at the time and more to do with what was going on in the economics profession. Namely, you had a revolution in ideas led by Milton Friedman and a lot of the Chicago School economists who were basically saying that markets ought to be kept free from government interference, and economic tools were not to be subjugated to a set of aims that were non-economic, national interest aims, however defined, to include foreign policy and national security. And I think this was really probably the biggest factor in the kind of steady separation of how the U.S. policymaking apparatus understands the job of economic policy as quite distinct from the sets of tools and logic that should guide our foreign policy. And so in my current role, I think a lot about the power of ideas. Things like popular sovereignty, the king is divine. We are always living in a set of scaffolding cabined by ideas. Faith in the efficiency of competitive markets populated by rational profit-maximizing individuals. These ideas aren't right or wrong. The test of their power is whether they are useful in solving problems that society needs to solve. So to wrap up in 30 seconds, in kind of the heady days of 1800s expansion, laissez-faire liberalism worked quite well to power that westward expansion. By the 1930s, we had different problems, and Keynesianism served us quite well to manage the excesses of the economy and create a strong role for the state that was needed to fight the Cold War. And by the 1970s, we had new problems for which the explanations that the Chicago School was offering suited us rather well. And I would submit that today we have problems like climate change, problems like economic inequality that markets alone can't solve. Whatever the science might have been 30 years ago on whether a price on carbon will solve climate, it can't today. We need a stronger role for the state. We need things like industrial policy to come back on the table. And that's why I am, here's your optimistic conclusion. You see proposals from both the right and the left. Marco Rubio, just a couple of weeks ago, announced a kind of bold vision around industrial policy. You see things like antitrust coming back on the table for reasons of small d democracy as much as consumer welfare as measured by price. Those narrow ideas of consumer welfare were really a figment of Chicago School thinking. So in conclusion, I think that there are green shoots. I'm happy to sort of tease them out with you during the Q&A about the next turn of the screw at the realm of ideas. Thanks.
Great. So thank you very much, Jennifer. That was really well done. I recommend Jennifer's book. There are some people who were present at the creation 30 years ago of this school. And I was just thinking back of what those people and their colleagues would have thought listening to Jennifer's presentation just now. I mean, on one hand, this school has been prescient on the point of a sort of skeptical assessment of pure Friedman-style Anglo-Saxon economics. Somebody who was a close friend of mine, I know many of you here, Chalmers Johnson, was of course a pioneer in thinking about that in international economic development, and a lively figure here, and so I think the school is with you on that point. Also, I'm thinking that when the school was founded 30 years ago, the assumption was that many parts of international life were moving towards a more rules-based procedure. The WTO was in sight, and NAFTA, and ideas of international legal orders, and just there would be less of this sort of tit-for-tat, pure scale, letting the bananas rot on the dock. And it's interesting that 30 years ago, that seemed as if that was something in view, and now there's evidence of the trend going the other way. So for our last introductory round presentation, I give you Arati, who's going to tell us about how we should think about the technology whose creation she has been centrally involved in. There you go, Arati.
Thank you so much, Jim. What a pleasure to be back in San Diego and on this wonderful campus and to be here with these panelists. Jen, I love the fact that you tried to end on a note of optimism, which I would summarize as things are so bad we might actually be able to start thinking again. So I'm all for that. What I want to do is add to this conversation that's been going on today the theme of technology, and to think about some of these issues with you through the lens of technology. And I want to give you 3 different examples of technologies that are both creating massive problems but also are part of some of the solutions that we're going to need to wrestle with everything that we've got out ahead of us. So let me talk about those and then maybe try to tie it back to the themes that we've been discussing today. So I'll start with a very old technology, and that was our ability over a couple of centuries, starting a couple of centuries ago, our ability to generate very cheap energy. And of course, this was a major part of what made industrialization and the Industrial Revolution possible. And through the long sweep of history, we know it was very, very bumpy getting through industrialization. But of course, that is what has allowed us ultimately now to lift billions of people out of poverty. And that was a technology revolution. Many technologies were involved, but that idea about cheap energy has had enormous implications. And of course, we've been talking today about one of the other consequences of abundant and cheap energy, an unintended consequence, which is the climate instability that we are now starting into, and really for the foreseeable future, this environment of deeply unstable climate that we are going to be grappling with. We've all noted that the world is not taking action at the rate that is required to avoid some of the very severe consequences that are coming up. But I would also note that as we do very slowly, not fast enough, but as we start putting in place the policies that are going to be necessary to wrestle with these climate implications and to try to stop the worst of the worst from happening, technology is actually going to play a role in that as well, because if we want to be able to meet the basic human needs of 10 or 11 billion people in the time ahead, technology is going to be part of how we continue to have abundant energy to continue to fuel economic growth, replacing fossil fuels. It's going to be necessary, we fear, to capture carbon out of the atmosphere. It's going to be necessary to reflect sunlight, to manage climate directly. It's also going to be necessary if we're going to be able to purify water. It's going to be necessary if we're going to be able to adapt crops to survive in the much harsher environment that they are part of. And so, again, the yin and the yang of technology, we're living with both the benefits and the dreadful implications of very cheap energy. As we think about these new technologies that can be part of the solution, again, I think we're going to have to really be thoughtful about what their downstream repercussions are as well. And I think that's how I see that cycle continuing. So that's one very massive set of technologies. Today we're dealing with a lot of the consequences. The second one on my list is one that first of all, you may not think of as a technology, but it is, I think, a technological capability, and it is one that has some pretty important implications, again, bright and dark today, and that is biomedicine. So, I think most of us think of what has come from biomedicine and biomedical research as something that is a good consequence. And I'm sure, certainly I know, and I'm sure everyone in this room has a friend or a family member who is with us today because of the advances that have come from biomedicine, and that, so absolutely enormous good has come from that. But I think there's a very interesting, again, an unintended consequence, and in this case it is not directly from the technology, but it's from the fact that in the United States we have gone all in on biomedicine as our strategy for thinking about healthcare, and it is one of the reasons that we are in this healthcare crisis that has, again, it's something we've been talking about during the day. Just to put some numbers on the things that people have mentioned today, in the United States today we spend 18% of GDP on our healthcare. That's over $3 trillion a year. That number continues to grow faster than GDP, as it has for a very long time. We are first in the world in per capita spending on healthcare. We are 33rd in the world in infant mortality, and we are 29th in the world in life expectancy. And in fact, life expectancy in the United States is dropping these last few years, in part because of what Ann Case and Angus Deaton concisely describe as deaths of despair, deaths from suicide, drug overdoses, and alcoholism. And, I think when you look at that, what you see is a good idea of this notion that a pill is going to solve the problem, taken to an extreme that has caused us to be blind to all the other factors that are going to be required for great health outcomes. And that too, so I think this is only one part of the reason that we are in the mess that we're in healthcare today. But I see this, the focus of innovation and technology in healthcare being so completely consumed by this biomedicine perspective, I think is something that reflects and then reinforces the way we've built incentives that have created a healthcare system that just really fundamentally is not working. And, I think we've talked a lot about what all those economic pressures are, but again, if you think about that 18% of GDP, every one of us as individuals feels that bite in our pocketbook. Every company in our economy feels that. And of course, that growing share in mandatory spending puts enormous pressure on all discretionary funding, defense and non-defense discretionary spending. So the implications are very significant. And very much, Bob, to your theme and many others, if we don't fix this problem among the other handful of major issues for us as a country, we're simply not going to figure out how to play our role in this changing world. My third example of a major technology is a technology that I think we all continue to call information technology. I will argue, though, that as computers have moved out of the mainframe room off in a corner and they've moved into our lives in the most intimate possible way, as information technology has come into our lives at every level we can imagine. It's time, I think, to start understanding that what's happening now, what's important now, is not about the ones and zeros, but it's actually about the fact that we're moving into a new experimental era for the social sciences. And in a sense, what's coming now is really social technology. And this is a technology that I think today we're at a moment where it's staggeringly easy to see the dark side of this. I'll just mention one of many components, which is Russia's interference in democratic processes across Europe, many countries, and of course, in 2006, starting in 2016, and as far as we can tell, continuing, even interfering in the democratic processes in the United States. I know everyone I talked to in my personal life was sort of shocked when we found out that Russia was messing in our elections in 2016. I reflected on what we knew about Russia's interference in many other democratic processes, Ukraine being just one example, from the work I'd done at DARPA. And my sense was the only thing that was shocking about the fact they were doing it in the United States is they think they can get away with it here. So that's the only thing that's really news. So that is a very dark side of the ability to manipulate and try to influence social behavior. That's an example of what's happening as information technology becomes social technology. I actually believe that there's also a very bright possibility, and it's not yet coming fully into focus, but let me tell you what the shape of it might look like. We talked in the earlier panel a lot about data, and I think that's the way we talk about it. What's happening is, I think, something that's a little bit broader and bigger, and that is that our ability to understand and influence deeply complex systems is starting to change. And it is changing because, first, our ability to analyze data at a scale and in ways that we've never had before. Secondly, because the sources of data and the types of data that we can aggregate are growing at a phenomenal pace. Third, because of our ability to start reasoning about complexity and starting now, I think, to be able to move in a very powerful way from simply doing correlative analysis to starting to reason about causality. And as we do these things, as we start being able to build better and more causally rooted models of very complex systems, this is a technological capability that is changing how we do biomedicine. It's changing our ability to understand what's happening inside of a cancer cell. It's changing our ability to build weather and climate models. And it's even starting to change our ability to understand the most complex systems in our world, which are human and societal and behavioral systems. And while these early examples are really quite chilling and very dark, I do see a revolution starting across the social sciences that I think is going to allow us to have some new tools. And you want to be very humble about this because the problems we're talking about are infinitely complex and they involve human beings who are the most marvelously unpredictable parts of any system you could imagine. So I'm not saying that the curtain's going to drop and all will be clear and we'll figure out how to do everything, but I am saying that I think we can now get on a path to slowly but surely get better at understanding and influencing these kinds of complex systems. And that's my attempt to add a note of optimism. I'll just finish by saying that the reason I think it's important to be mindful of these technology factors is that technology is a major change agent. Sometimes the changes that it brings are massive. They can be tectonic in nature. Technology itself, of course, is fundamentally amoral. It doesn't care how the world turns out. And it's this very human business that all of us are engaged in that ultimately determines how we harvest the best from technology and minimize its impacts. And so in many ways, I think these major technology shifts now put even more pressure on us to deal in an intelligent way across many, many countries with the challenges that we have ahead. Thank you.
So there's a category of insights which I particularly value, which is things that are obvious as soon as they're pointed out. And I think in that category goes the idea that biomed is the U.S. strategy for healthcare, which explains both what's good about American healthcare and what's bad about American healthcare. So thank you for pointing out that clearly. I am going to confine myself to one question only for these our panelists, just so we can involve everybody in the audience. I'm going to start with Bob. And I'm going to say that there are, let us do something unfair and imagine ourselves at the 50th anniversary of GPS's founding and how people will be looking back on this era of the 30th anniversary. There are times in history that are bad but get better. The 1960s in the U.S., which we both were part of, that was a horrible time for the United States, but things in various ways were better after the assassinations and the riots and all the other protests of the 1960s. The 1850s in the United States were bad and things got worse. The 1920s in Europe were bad and things got worse. Will people 20 years from now look back on these eras of governance and institutions as a time when things were bad but got better, or bad and they got worse?
That's a question.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you for calling on me first. It's a great, I appreciate it, being put on the spot. I mean, making a prediction about 20 years from now, Jim, as you correctly point out, is challenging because it's hard enough to figure out what's going to happen in the next 2 years. But I would make the point, I'd like to start on the optimistic side, and I appreciate the sort of lead into this. I do think that on the positive side, one thing is going to be very important, and that is younger generations of Americans and younger generations around the world have a much more internationally oriented approach to life. They've, in many cases, traveled more. They interact using modern technology with people in other societies and other countries. Let's take GPS. The number of foreign students here is vastly different from what it was 30 years ago. And the amount of interaction among American students and foreign students studying not just here but in other parts of the world, that creates an environment of human interaction, which we did not have in the world 30 years ago, not even close. So when you add the communications, the awareness of what's going on around the world by younger generations, the fact that so many people study together, nearly half of all the really innovative research, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on the numbers, is done by groups of people and much of it is cross-border interaction, the really great scientific papers and discoveries. Let's take biotech. A lot of the Nobel Prize awards have gone to people, someone working in Israel, in China, in the United States, and Britain, working together. The scientific interaction on climate change, huge amounts of interaction. And I think this, to me, this whole new generation of science, of education, of interaction through modern telecommunication systems and the internet, and just a broader awareness, to me, is really, if there is to be a better outcome, it's because of that. The technology, the human interaction, I think is going to be extremely important. On the negative side, I would say that it may take a big shock to the system to get there. How did we get from the horrible world of 2000, of 1919, 1920, 1921, 22, that the world was moving in the wrong direction? What happened? It took a war. It took a depression and a war, both, to create an environment of cooperation. It wouldn't have happened but for that. And even then, it not only took a depression and a war. The reason the U.S. came together in a consensus between Senator Vandenberg and President Truman and others was the threat from the Soviet Union. Had the Soviets not overreached and gone into Czechoslovakia and encroached on Eastern Europe, it would have been very hard to get a consensus in this country for an international foreign policy to support the GATT, to support the IMF, to support the World Bank. It took these shocks, and it's a concern in a way, and maybe a concern with a silver lining, that at some point in the next, let's say 20 years, to use your time frame, we will confront some very bad thing that will happen. I mentioned some kind of pandemic. The climate crisis gets worse. There's a huge instance of a cyber attack which disables not a little country like Ukraine or Estonia, but a big country, and knocks out the capability of a major economy to provide food and water to its people. These kinds of cyber attacks, either by another government or by some third country agent, some disruptor. So it may well take, if you go back to history, some very brutal, some horrible, some really costly in human terms action from within a government or from outside to cause people to realize that we have to sit down and get together to deal with problems. So that to me is how I would size it. Predicting what it will look like 20 years from now is hard to do, but I think the basis of the human interaction that I mentioned earlier is a positive thing, and it may well be that it takes some very bad negative thing to get us to a more positive environment down the road. I just like to make one last point, and that is, I think Gabriela made a very interesting point. It's hard to imagine it happening without American leadership today. And then, so the next question is, will America come back to a leadership role? I've indicated there are a number of reasons that we may be more xenophobic and more nationalistic. At some point, it's not impossible that between now and 20 years from now, a whole different attitude will occur in the United States, and people will understand that it's in our interest to be a global leader. Then the second question is, if not, are the Chinese capable of doing that? Do they want to do that? And that, to me, is a question we're going to have to answer. They want to have a leadership role in the Belt and Road in Latin America, but as John Negroponte pointed out, they don't want to disrupt the global system. They want to change the global system. It's been in their interest to have it. And therefore, I suspect that China will try to play a leadership role if the United States doesn't, and it sort of leaves the field open to them doing it. Are they able at this point? The point was made earlier, it took the United States 100 years to get to a leadership role. Can the Chinese do it in 20 or 30? That's a question we can debate, but it may well depend on that if the United States can't step up and play its traditional role.
Great. Thank you. So, Gabriela, the version of the question for you is the taking you as representing all international institutions right now, is your collective assumption that the United States has backing out and will continue to back out, or the United States is backing out but will return?
I actually think that this is a question for an American.
We don't know the answer either, so.
No, the problem here is that this is what I mentioned is that if you look where we are, is the result of very bad outcomes of the growth path that we decided to follow during the last decade. Jennifer mentioned the question of leave the markets alone and the government will just intervene whenever there is a market failure and reduce the interventions. And we know now, after the crisis, that there is a very strong need of good regulatory power of the state. And therefore, I feel that the leadership of the US is going to be determined by how much you are also able to address the issues inside. How do you avoid having such a polarized, and I'm not talking about only the US, I'm talking about many countries, including mine, who have very polarized political systems. As I say, that it's impossible to get consensus on anything, because what is happening is that you have very strong extremes. I mean, I look at Enrico, I'm sorry, but the fact is that you have the extreme right with the extreme left forming a government. What kind of solutions that will provide? So my deep reflection here is that we need to get ourselves a more effective way of addressing these problems, the inequality, the climate, and to give people answers. And to do that, in the OECD, we have a program that is a new approaches to economic challenges. You cannot solve the issues by doing the same things that you did to create them. So the point here is, how do we change this growth paradigm that we always have to say, you just grow first and then you fix or clean the climate, you grow first and then it will trickle down. It didn't happen. So for us, the framing should be, how do we go for measuring better the results that we're trying to achieve? How do we ensure that we put people well-being as the objective? No GDP growth, not averages, not aggregates, just well-being of people. How do we ensure that we factor in ex ante, not ex post, the resource-based depletion that we are having with our growth model? How do we give answers to all these youngsters that are in the streets? 18 million youngsters demonstrated for climate. I don't know if people are listening or not. But the fact is that we need to fix those problems, build a system that is much more constructive, and then you will be strong, because you need to be strong inside. I could not agree more with Bob. You need to be strong inside to be strong outside. But I'm an optimistic. I'm an optimist. So I feel that all of this is man-made. I wish I could have women-made, but no, not that many women in the leadership. Sorry, guys, but this is man-made. I think it can be women and mind corrected. So I leave it there.
Thank you. So Jennifer, just actuarially, you're more likely to be at the 50th anniversary than I am. So when you're back at the 50th anniversary and assessing the sort of hydraulic correlation of forces, the rebound and resilience forces that you mentioned at the end versus the forces of dysfunction and disaffection and extremism, all the rest, how do you think you will look back and say, oh yes, we can see the rebound forces actually are viable, or that was just something we were telling ourselves to feel better?
Ever an optimist. I hope to look back 20 years from now heartened that we found a theme of generational justice that we could, that really brought us together. Whether it's myself with a 16-month-old paying what I pay for childcare, for the privilege of driving an hour and a half each way every day, and how insane that is to the undersaving and retirement crisis that a lot of people 50 and over are facing. I would hope that what gets built into a lot of markets and models is right now the things that are unseen and therefore unpriced. And if we manage to do that, I think the politics sorts itself out. That's why I come back to a lot of the political dysfunction right now being a byproduct of ideas as much as partisan polarization or filibuster or not. Those things are important and we need to sort them out. But I think so much of the scaffolding, the kind of boundaries of our political imagination are mediated by ideas. And that's not just, and so obviously there is a massive role for the academy and for places like GPS to play in that. Now we need academics to think differently, ask bigger questions, resist the pressures of over-specialization, understand themselves to be part of some common intellectual project that's bound to necessary academic boundaries and disciplines. And we need to join that with grassroots organizers and movement people like Sunrise and arm them with a story. Ultimately, that's what a lot of this shapes out to. It's what the Chicago School did so well. It cohered into a story. And I think we are beginning to see the green shoots of the next story, and I have a feeling generational justice will be well represented within it.
So Arthur, you have the last word on the unfair question of how you think we will look back on this moment in our history.
Let's see. What can I add? The only thing I can think to add to this very good conversation, it strikes me that a lot of the discussion in the United States today is a nostalgia for this post-World War II period. But that was a very, very, very unusual period. And I think, of course, we were doing really well. Our economy was growing, and we figured out how to share that growth. Sorry? Not everyone was doing well in that period, but relatively it was a great period for the United States. I think the key point in my mind was the world was not in very good shape at that time, and actually the world is in a much better place today in terms of how many people can survive and feed their children and have some kind of a good life ahead. And so I'm not sure that nostalgia for those good old days is right. And what my hope is for 20 years from now is that the United States has started to figure out, because I think it'll take longer than 20 years, but if we can start figuring out what it means to play our role as a strong nation in a world where everyone is part of going forward, I think that would be a great outcome.
So we're going to have time for one or two questions. I'll go selectively towards the back of the room on sort of distributional justice principles, but I can't see back there. So it's somebody who can see. Yes, if microphones will just go to people in the back room, just choose people.
Okay, my name is Andrea Ding Kemp, class of '94, and sitting here thinking about 20 years from now and thought about what 20 years ago was when I was in school. I like to point out one point, and you can take it as a positive point, a negative point, or just a point that may make you think. 20 years from now, how many of the panels will be Chinese nationals? I mean, Chinese Americans who actually grow up in China and being a U.S. citizen and loves U.S. and even have 2 U.S. kids. How many of that panel 20 years from now will be that? The reason I'm saying this is not negative. I'm in business. I've been in management for many, many years. But when everybody talks about China, I'm the one sitting there listening. And no one actually asked me, hey, Andrea, what do you think about China? And I'm used to just sit there and listening. So with the ongoing media, makes it even harder to the challenge in the future for people, for everybody to think about it. when you think about China, what do you feel like?
Yes, and so since we just have a couple of minutes, I understand your point. I'm going to take the answer to this one. And so I've spent about 5 years of my life living in China with my wife, and precisely because it's so fascinating to hear what people in China think and what they do and what their hopes are and what their disappointments are. And something I think is of paramount importance, and I hope is the case 20 years from now, is whoever is on the panel, whatever variety of American backgrounds are here, I hope more and more American people will have spent serious time in China. They'll go to school there, they'll work there, they'll travel there, because I think there's no other way to get a sense of the scale, the successes, the challenges, the vivid humanity of China than to be there. So, yes, I am with you that Americans need to have more and more, Americans of all ethnic background need to have more and more exposure to China. Does anyone dissent?
No, can I just make one addendum to what Jim said? That is, I hope that if this panel, we have a similar panel 20 years from now, there are Chinese on the panel, because Americans need to understand the Chinese culture and China a lot better than they do. I would also make a similar point, and that is, if there's a similar panel in China, that there are an equal number of Americans sitting on there to be able to describe America's point of view and how America sees the world. Because that, if we talk about a level playing field, the level playing field should be not just about trade and investment. It should be about interaction among ideas in the United States vis-a-vis China and vice versa, but other countries as well, India and others.
For example, one's books could get translated into Chinese and be published there, etc. But yes.
One minute provocation.
Yes.
I would say that it's not only about getting to know China. I think it's getting to know the world.
Right.
And I commend the GPS, because you have this requirement for your students to speak other languages. I have to say that that's a handicap for Americans. Learning other languages is learning how others think. It's not a tool. And I have to say that I know too many American friends that are very high position not speaking a second language.
And also, I think one point that Chinese leaders make is, our history, no offense to John Negroponte, our history really tends to begin with Greece. And the Chinese always make the point, I'm sure you've heard that we know almost nothing of Asian history. And they know a lot about American history. And without that historical context, it's very hard to really understand the Chinese and all their dynasties. And they look at themselves not as an up-and-coming country. They look at themselves as a country that was the dominant, the Middle Kingdom, for 5,000 years. And they had 2 bad centuries where the West has taken advantage of them, which is true, where they've been internally divided, which is true, and now they're coming back. So they see their role as a world leader, not as something new, but as something they have, a role they've played in the past, and they say, well, we lost in the first industrial revolution, we really didn't participate, because the foreigners we were weak and we were taking advantage of the second
one. So who
one.
has a microphone in the back?
Now they want to play a role in the third industrial revolution, which is the IT AI revolution.
Hello. Oh, hello? Yeah. Hi. I'm a classmate of Andrea's. 谢谢你啊. I was actually under Chalmers Johnson, and I did Japan and Chinese political economy. Worked at Treasury. My name is Andrew Veltau, sorry. Just trying to hurry along here. I did, was at RPS, Treasury Department on international economic policy, worked at the World Bank on climate, and then most recently have done some political work in places, deindustrialized places like in Pennsylvania and Ohio. This was an excellent panel. I have one specific question, just a very few comments, hurrying up, to set it up. Economic ideology, economic policy, technology, language, and political economy. The United States, it's no longer August 1945. The structures and the ideologies that might have worked for the United States in the past, we have to think whether or not they're purpose fit, because other countries, they plan for the future. They think strategically. They think nationally. And so my question, also language, don't call out of work people losers. They want jobs. The main problem in the United States and in Europe right now, I think, is hopelessness. And so how do you try and shape the powers of technology to benefit people more broadly and not just corporate shareholders? My question ultimately is this: how does the United States, and how should it, reform its political economy system, both domestically and internationally, to respond to these challenges? Because Trump is a very ham-fisted answer to this, but it needs to evolve. It's, thanks.
So I'm going to use my powers as moderator to assign Arati the answer to this question, which I think, and then we're going to have time for like one brief question that Peter will choose, who is this last brief questioner, and then we'll give a... So, Arati, you can answer.
Well,
Peter will choose a question.
I actually think some of the things Jennifer talked about start to get at an answer to that. I think my view is we are at a moment in our political discourse in the United States. My hope, Bob, is that things have actually gotten bad enough that we can start having some breakthroughs in thinking. And there are some very important and worthy of consideration policy proposals that candidates for president in 2020 are starting to make. And I hope this is going to be that kind of inflection point.
And there's much more to say about that, but not at this moment. Peter, choose one more person.
All right, I see a green.
Yes. Okay. Okay.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. My name is Igor Malinov. I'm class 96. My question is about economical sanctions imposed to countries as a tool to influence. I remember in Soviet Union many mothers and fathers, when they've been frustrated, cannot make children behave well, they used a pant belt to punish. Do you think economical sanctions is a good tool to maintain world order? And if yes, why? And if no, what can we do to help our leaders to make other tools to influence or to unite other countries, including our alumni, professors, and other people?
Excellent question. I know everybody would have answers, but I'm going to assign Jennifer to answer this.
Yes, I think that sanctions have a mixed record. I think they're getting more effective as we move more into the financial realm. There is a lot of concern, I think, warranted about some of the internal challenges that use or potential overuse of especially financial sanctions raises. Does it, for example, incentivize a race to an alternative global reserve currency so that the desire to transact global trade and financial services in dollars does not become a binding constraint in the way that's what's doing a lot of the work behind the potency of U.S. financial sanctions. I think that's a warranted concern, but as long as the alternative to a lot of these challenges, which are real challenges, it's not serious to sort of say, we'll just look the other way on Iranian or North Korean nuclear threats. That's not an answer. Nor do I think is there much appetite for occupation and very expensive, bloody military contests. So I'm actually heartened by and will stand behind the U.S.'s growing use of financial sanctions, as long as the denominator or the kind of alternatives are military options that we should be very careful about before expending blood and treasure. As someone who comes from a military family and knows all too well what we ask for men and women in uniform, I'm quite comfortable looking at all other forms of pressure before we go to military options. And that's why I worked with this book to try to make sure that we are assigning the same sort of sets of questionings to how we think through the use of economic force in the U.S. as we think through potential use of military force.
Well, first of all, on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank this entire panel for pushing us to ask both the conventional and the unconventional about how to think about the prospects for world order. I will give my answer, which is 20 years from now, there'll still be a great group of scholars and students here figuring it out. All right?